My name is Christopher Jones, and I'm the Public Affairs Associate at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I would like to welcome you all to our Child and Family Policy Forum. We would like to thank those of you who are here in person and those of you that are joining us on our live video webcast for taking the time to be with us today. Today's program is titled, Children Whose Parents Have Experienced Childhood Trauma, Challenges, Obligations, and Reasonable Efforts for Reunification. I know you will find today's conversation both lively and informative. Moderating our panel of experts on this topic is Ada Skiles, Associate Director of Chapin Hall. Again, thank you very much for participating in today's program. I'll now turn the program over to Ada, who will introduce our panel to you. Ada?
Good morning, everyone. Whether parents can overcome the problems that lead to abuse and neglect of their children is the essence of questions surrounding efforts to return children to their parents once legal custody of a child has been granted to the Child Welfare Agency. Consistent with a legal and policy framework protecting parental rights in the United States, the threshold for separating a child from his or her parents is set high, and family reunification is the preferred permanency goal for most children who come into the child welfare system. Despite this policy preference, reunification rates are lower than desired, and even when reunification does happen, some children experience subsequent placements. In this forum, we'll discuss findings from a Chapin Hall report in which researchers identified a subset of parents involved with the child welfare system who have extensive childhood trauma experiences and face multiple challenges or service needs. These findings have implications for caseworker engagement and service interventions. And they also raise fundamental questions about our obligation and approaches to working with parents, protecting children, and promoting well-being. This forum will also discuss changes to policies and practices in the child welfare, legal, and human services fields that may be necessary in order to improve the well-being of this group of children and their families. Also, please, I would like to remind those of you who are not here today but listening that if you have questions and would like to contribute to the webcast, please use the Twitter hashtag #ChapinForum. You can post questions on the UChicago Live Facebook page, or you can send an email to policyforum@chapinhall.org. At this time, I'd like to introduce the panelists, and we will begin the forum. To my left is Cheryl Smithgall, the Acting Executive Director of Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. Next to her is Jill Duer-Barrick, Zellerbach Family Foundation Professor, School of Social Welfare, the University of California at Berkeley. And Robert Harris, the Cook County Public Guardian. Our first speaker will be Cheryl Smithgall.
Thank you, Ada, and welcome everybody. I'm going to start us off by highlighting a few findings from a paper that we recently released as part of an evaluation of the Illinois Integrated Assessment Program. For those of you who are not familiar with the program, let me describe it a little bit. I think it'll be helpful context for some of the discussion that we're going to have. The Illinois Integrated Assessment Program is a process that takes place in the first 45 days of placement when a child enters foster care. It's a comprehensive family assessment, so it covers domains such as medical, social, developmental, mental health, and education. It includes assessments and interviews with children, siblings, and the adults in the household who are caring for those children. Excuse me. It's a dual professional model, so there's a child welfare caseworker paired with a licensed clinician with mental health experience, and together they conduct the assessment and put together an assessment report. The report serves as a foundation for informed decision-making regarding service intervention. We looked at a set of these assessments for about 85 families. Those 85 families had 140 parents and 176 children, ages 0 to 17. We went through those assessments to understand the extent to which the parents talked about having adverse child experiences in their history. So this is using information from the CDC ACEs study. And they have a list of 10 adverse childhood experiences that comprise a short form. The short form was not administered to these families, but in the narrative reports where they talked with the licensed clinician and the child welfare caseworker about their histories, there was sufficient detail to understand whether they had had some of these experiences. So those adverse childhood experiences include various types of abuse, as well as divorce and loss of a parent, domestic violence, substance abuse by someone in the home, criminal behavior, and mental illness. The research that's been done out of the CDC study suggests that a threshold of 4 or more of these ACEs is associated with poor adult functioning outcomes or health outcomes. So when we looked at the families that were in this sample, we saw that 47% of the mothers had reported 4 or more of these ACEs, and 23% of fathers reported 4 or more ACEs. As a point of comparison, the original study by the CDC, 15% of women and 9% of men reported having 4 or more ACEs. I should also mention that these families, the IA program at the time that we were pulling the assessments for the study, the IA program was primarily focused on families where they'd gone through the investigation and a decision was made for the child to go immediately into placement. So this does not include the population of child welfare families where there may be in-home or intact services prior to a foster care placement. So why do we want to understand their childhood experiences? I think one of the things that is important to note is that the integrated assessment program was designed to elicit a deeper understanding of parents' functioning. And in doing so, they embrace a developmental perspective. There are a couple of key principles of that developmental perspective on this slide. And there's an understanding that problematic behavior evolves over time as a result of successive experiences. Negative experiences in one time can pose challenges in accomplishing developmental tasks at a later time. Examples of how this came through in the narrative assessments, we would see examples where parents would talk about their young, early childhood and often describe not having a parent in a protective role. When they talked about their adolescence, they would describe drinking, using drugs, being involved in violent incidents or gangs. They would have discipline problems, and they would drop out of school. And the accumulation of some of these experiences would contribute to their adult functioning, which I will describe in a few minutes. I think it's important to say at this point, though, there's nothing in this study that supports a conclusion of intergenerational transmission of abuse. This is not a study where we prospectively followed families. What we do want to say is that for those families that are involved with the child welfare system and have these significant histories, we think there are important implications for intervening and practice with these families. So among the parents that had significant trauma histories in their childhood, we saw that fewer of them, compared to other families involved with child welfare, had stable employment or post-secondary education. More of them had problems in 3 or more areas of functioning. So 80% of those families, there was an adult with either mental health, substance abuse, resources, residential stability, domestic violence, 3 of those types of problems. A majority of these families, even though they were aware of the problems that they currently faced, were resistant to participating in services through the child welfare system. And yet 2/3 had described having previously participated in mental health treatment, and 1/3 had experienced a psychiatric hospitalization before. I know I'm giving some snapshots. We're going to weave this together in the discussion, but I want to follow up with the last sort of data point in describing challenges in predicting and maintaining reunification for these families. So the assessments that are done in the first 45 days of the case include a statement about the prognosis for reunification. And when we reviewed those statements, we saw that 1/3 of these families with the significant childhood trauma histories, where the parent, at least one parent had this sort of trauma history, 1/3 of these parents were described as having a poor, unlikely, or unfavorable prognosis for reunification with their children within the first 45 days. 1/3 was described as having a guarded prognosis, and 1/3 was described as having a favorable prognosis. Those with a favorable prognosis often also included statements about the parents' willingness to change or willingness to work with service providers. On the bottom half of the slide, we have some data from looking at the reunification 30 months after they entered foster care. We found that 1/3 of children were reunified with their parents, but it was really not different depending on whether the parent or any parent in the family had disclosed significant trauma history in their childhood. What we did see, though, is that more of the children with a parent who had that trauma history came back into foster care a second time after that reunification. I want to put out there some questions for some critical thinking and discussion. Before we get a chance to do that, I'm going to invite Jill and Robert to add their perspectives from practice and their field experience as well as their own research. In closing, I just want to say the comprehensive family assessments inform our understanding of the variability in the population that is served by child welfare, and also sheds light on barriers to engaging parents and to parents engaging in and completing services. We want to think about how the child welfare system serves these families, how they understand the parents' attitudes towards services, what the workers' approaches are to engaging these families, what we understand about the quality and availability of providers and treatment programs, the effectiveness of particular treatments that are available to these families, and the court processes that may also influence the outcomes for these families. With that, I am going to turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Cheryl. Delighted to be here. Hello, everybody. I love Cheryl and her colleagues' study because it reveals so much that we know. So many of our families are very complicated. They bring very complex issues with them. And this really reveals the depth of some of the tremendous challenges many of our families have faced before we even see them. I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to raise 3 topics that her study suggests to me. And again, we can engage in a larger conversation later. But this raises questions for me about the issue of reunification prognosis. That also raises some questions about parents' path to change. How do parents change? And thirdly, about the role of services in reunification efforts. So first, let me speak for a minute about reunification prognosis, because Cheryl suggested that workers indicated whether or not they thought a family was relatively likely to reunify, moderately likely, or not particularly likely to reunify. And what's interesting about that was that workers were often wrong. So I just want to suggest a couple of things about this. I think that we need to really, in our field, we need to become data friendly and data friends with our data, as a colleague of mine, Barbara Needell, often says. Practice wisdom of social workers should always be honored, and it should be celebrated whenever possible, but only when it's better than data in predicting a particular outcome. So what we know about some research that Cheryl's done, some of my own research with my colleague Amy DeAndrade, that when we ask workers to assess the likelihood of reunification for families, this particular decision, workers often get it wrong. And so what that suggests to me is that we really need to be doing a lot more in the field of research to be developing data to help us better understand the likelihood of reunification. Now, I talk about the likelihood of reunification, and people might get worried, and they say, oh, well, if somebody's a low likelihood of reunification, doesn't that mean you're going to give up on them? Of course not. Of course not. We never give up on our families. You talk to any social worker, and they will tell you we never give up on our families. But understanding who has a high likelihood of reunification versus a relatively low likelihood of reunification does help decision-making, particularly around concurrent planning. If the data suggest that a family has a relatively low likelihood of reunification, then of course we engage in services. And of course we do everything we can to help them reunify. but it also means that those families should be considered for concurrent planning early on in the case. We don't have limitless resources. Not every family can or should go to concurrent planning, so we should be making those choices based upon data about real likelihoods rather than based upon our practice wisdom. So I think data technologies can continue to be developed as we understand the characteristics of families who present to us and whether or not they're likely to reunify. And we can change the algorithms over time as new families present and we gather more information about the families coming into our field. You know, we ask parents to change their lives a lot when they come in contact with the child welfare system, and yet we don't know very much about what helps to motivate parents to change. Many birth parents will tell us that when they decided to change their life in order to reunify with their child, they had to change everything. They had to change their friends. They had to change how much contact they had with their family members. They had to change the neighborhood in which they lived. They had to change their daily activities and tasks because they had habituated to so many different negative life events. And so when we ask them to change, we're not just asking them to change their parenting, we're asking them to change their lives pretty fundamentally. And yet we know very little about what is that motivational moment when parents say, everything's going to be different. I'm going to try my best to be different. Our research in this area is really in its infancy. Julia Littell has done some work on the stages of change theory. It doesn't necessarily hold up. Cheryl's done some work on the trans-theoretical models of change. We're not quite sure what this is that help. What are those moments when parents decide that they're going to change? What we do know from the research is one of the most consistent features in the reunification literature is that we're interested in parents' compliance with services. We know that from a variety of research studies that when parents comply with services, they're more likely to reunify. Not when they change their parenting, when they comply with services. And that's a really interesting finding. If our research generally says that one of the most critical factors in determining whether a family is going to reunify is whether they comply, then that suggests to me something sort of worrisome about the power imbalance between social workers and birth parents. What we really need to understand much better is when they engage in services, do they change their parenting? And that's what we need to be especially concerned about. We need to change our paradigm from compliance with services to changing to adequate parenting practices. And I think we need a lot more research in this area. I'd like to see some randomized trials of solution-based casework because I think that has some promise around really looking at some very narrow, specific things parents need to change and then seeing whether or not those parents have made changes in those areas. And then thirdly, I'd like to say a couple of words about the role of services because really the research base around the role of services in helping parents reunify is remarkably limited. When we look at the reunification literature, what do we know? Well, we know that certain parents with certain characteristics are more likely to reunify. And certain kids with certain characteristics are more likely to reunify. And placing children in certain homes are more likely to result in reunification. I didn't mention services. We don't know very much about what services help families reunify. And yet, what is a child welfare system built upon? Services. We can't change the characteristics of the families that present to us. We can change our service delivery models of what we give to clients, but we don't know very much. We know some work from Joe Ryan's, know some information from Joe Ryan's work about how to help substance abusing families with very comprehensive residential substance abuse treatment services. We know a little bit about the role of intensive experiential parenting programs, but we really know very little about the role of services. And as Cheryl's work suggests, the service needs of the parents with significant childhood trauma are very, very significant. And so what our typical response is as a child welfare agency is to pile on multiple services to meet the multiple needs of families. My dear colleague, Amy DeAndrade, has done some work on reunification. She found in California, and maybe California is really a wacky place, but in California, the average family is required to participate in an average of 8 services per week. Now, I don't know about you, but my life's kind of full. I think your lives are kind of full. If any of us were asked to pile on 8 new things to do in any given week and to consistently do them, I think many of us would fail. And so do we encourage our families to fail because of these typical case plans? Her more recent work suggests that the amount of time it would take to actually complete those 8 service events in a given week would be between 22 and 26 hours per week. So that really suggests that we need to do a lot of thinking about whether or not the number of services we're providing to families or mandating of families are really the best way to go about helping them reunify. And then finally, if we're going to pile on a lot of services on families, let's make sure that they are effective. Let's make sure that those services will get us what we want from families. You know, the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare lists a lot of services that we think are effective based upon solid, empirically based research and randomized clinical trials. Do you know what happens when you press the reunification button on that website? We don't have evidence-based services to help families reunify. So I think that it's very, very clear that we need to develop services that families find helpful. We need to find services that the research base suggests are evidence-based and that will help families reunify. And we need to really target our efforts in the future to reunification services that are going to get us what we want, which is improved parenting for the kids in our service system.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
You'll have to forgive me. I forgot my glasses, but I have a lot of notes, but I can't see, so I might miss some points. So to put it a little bit in context, I'm Robert Harris. I work with a bunch of lawyers. My office is a law office that represents the children here in Cook County, in Chicago, and the Cook County suburbs. We represent about 6,000 children. Although we're a law office, we work with social workers, a psychologist, a nurse, paralegals, and many others, investigators, to try and adequately represent our children. I should say our clients, because I often get chastised for saying our children. We're not their parents. We are their lawyers. We are their advocates. And we represent both what they want, their wishes, as well as what's best for them, what's in their best interest. You know, I have to admit, when I first read Cheryl's study, as a typical lawyer, I started to pick it apart and question the efficacy in terms of the work that I do in the cases that we represent children on. Many of our cases are families who have had a great deal of experience in the system, and so for you lawyers out there, you're probably doing the same thing as I was doing. So just to put you into my transition into why I thought it was a great study and certainly something important to take back to my office is, although our cases we have a lot more information about our cases generally when they come in, although the demographics of who our families are and the children involved in the cases that I represent children on are different than maybe what was outlined in Cheryl's study. The important point was that as much as we can know about a family, really it helps us advocate as a child's lawyer for what they need and what's best for them. When the case first comes in, generally our goal is return home, unless something heinous happens and people are pretty much quickly looking toward early termination of parental rights. But generally that's not the cases that we see. So the more that we know about the family and the needs of the child, the better we are able to advocate for our client. The presenting abuse and neglect issues, the service needs of the child, and in general, the family dynamics are all crucial to understand why a case comes into court. Of course, the parents' issues are important, including their own histories of abuse, in order to make decisions about what the next steps might be in a case and what services should be offered. The integrated assessment is a tool that is important to help gauge what the needs of the children are and what the family have for the service providers to be able to select appropriate plans and services to facilitate a return home, visitation between parents and their children, visitation between siblings if they're not placed together, which is an important point that's often missed in some of the in some cases, and even in those cases that there is some decision or some thought that there might not be an ability to reunify, concurrent planning, thinking about adoption or guardianship. However, although a great deal of information can be derived from the integrated assessments, most of the information that is provided is self-reported, particularly in the context of Cheryl's study, where there is no previous DCFS involvement. So it's important for social workers, clinicians, and attorneys to act as fact finders, to try to get as much information as you can from collateral resources as possible. That means talking to other family members, any other agencies that they might be involved with, to try to put together a holistic picture of who the family is and what they might need. Because it's important to identify those issues as they act as a bar to successful reunification and the services needed to ameliorate the reasons for the case coming into court. It's also important to develop clear recommendations and to do that as early as possible that represent the individual needs of the parents and of the children so that there is meaningful participation by the parents. And so I agree with you, Jill, so that you have meaningful participation by the parents in services that really address their ability to parent as opposed to their participation in a cookie cutter service that results in a check mark on a service plan. And we've all seen that, I think. And that's something, as practitioners, we get hooked into, but when you really delve down underneath, that's not really what we want. We want really meaningful services because we want meaningful services because it'll effectuate, I believe, return home a lot quicker and a lot long lasting. One of the very important aspects of Cheryl's study was the findings relative to return home rates of parents who had 4 ACEs or the adverse childhood experiences and parents who had under 4 ACEs. And although I think her findings held that those parents who had either more or less than 4 both had similar return home outcomes, that it was far greater for those parents who had more than 4 ACEs to have their children return into the system. And as a lawyer who represents children, that's not what I want. We want children to go home when it's possible, and we want there to be as little trauma to them as we can have as a system. Because once we step into their lives, we're there for a purpose, and that is to hopefully lessen the trauma in their lives. We often talk about issues about minimum parenting standards, and we also often debate about whether we should be addressing only those issues that bring a case into court, i.e., if the case came in because of the parent's drug use, maybe we shouldn't be dealing with issues of domestic violence, or if the issues were around mental illness, whether or not we should be dealing with issues of drug use. But as a child's attorney, again, I have to say that our goal is to reunify children when we can to those parents who are equipped to raise them so that those children can go home and stay home longer. And if we don't pay attention to other issues that really impact parenting, then we're missing the point. So things like their previous experiences as children or as young people, teenagers, where they themselves were abused. If we don't deal with some of those issues, we're never going to get to the root of what the issues were that brought the case into court. Now I'm going to give you one of the truisms about the system as a practitioner, and those other folks who were practitioners, and those of you who were practitioners and then went into academia or did other forms of research. We often find ourselves at odds with the tenets of certain lofty things such as AFSA, the American Safe Families Act, and even some of the tenets that we hold in our own particular statutes. And I say that because we have to look at how to proceed in a case where we're faced with decisions about what the best interest is for our clients, along with their wishes, the family dynamics, such as a parent's substance abuse issues, when one parent is more ready to receive the children home than another parent, and then has the responsibility, and we talked about that, of having to protect the children from the other parent, and the court making them responsible for that. But because our cases are where the child's best interests don't always fit into a type timeline that's set forth under the various statutes, you have to really be flexible in terms of the way in which you're applying the facts in the case. So you might not seek termination of parental rights in a case where there was a death of a sibling that was held to be responsible, and I know this is like witchery when I say this, is held to be responsible by one of the parents, or where the parent may have had several instances of relapse of substance abuse. But what the fortunate thing is, I have the best clients in the system. Those are the children. And so I can focus on what they want, on what's best for them, and I can look at things like where they're placed and other factors that involve their own lives and advocate accordingly. I'm sure we'll have more opportunity to talk about some of these issues, but thank you. I hope I can read the rest of my notes.
Great. Well, thanks to all of our panelists. So at this point, what I would like to do is explain to those of you here that we look forward to having questions from you posed to our panelists. And what we have are two people with microphones, so if you raise your hand, they will give you the microphone. What we ask is that you give your name and your affiliation, if you're with an organization, and also to ask you on behalf of everyone to really phrase a question so that there's something for the panelists to react to. For those of you who are listening, again, I want to, and watching online, I'd like to remind you that you can send in your questions by using the Twitter hashtag Chapin Forum. You can post your questions on UChicago Live Facebook page, and you can send an email to policyforum@chapinhall.org. We have a question from one of our remote participants, and I will pose it to all of you, and you can feel comfortable responding or not. Can you speak about defining or addressing what is may be called protective instinct? Many of these families have domestic violence in their background, and often the mother is criticized for not exhibiting a protective instinct as evidenced by her reaction to the domestic violence perpetrator. So in terms of looking at this subpopulation, what do you think about exhibiting or your reaction to or any research about protective instinct, and what would be a appropriate normal trauma response in regards to domestic violence? So through your cases or your own experiences.
Well, I mean, since we're confronted with that quite often, I mean, you do look for, there's a balancing act, I think, that you have to take into consideration, because most children want to be with their parents, right? That's the first thing that we always see. I've been very few clients that I've had that did not want to be at home with their mother or father, even in the face of some really traumatic experiences. But when you're looking at that, you have to look at, pretty much how long and how protective a parent could be, for a child, because, ultimately, our responsibilities or their responsibilities as a parent is, in my belief, to protect their children even from themselves. And so that means even if they feel like they can't get out of a situation, when they have a child there, that should kind of up the ante in terms of their responsiveness for safety.
I would just add, I think in terms of the assessments that we reviewed and some of the cases in which we saw this dynamic, I think this is where it's really valuable to have that family perspective and to then engage the caseworker and the person who is continuing to work with this family in thinking through the complicated dynamics that exist for a family where you're asking one parent to have a protective role. And you may also need to be simultaneously working with the other parent to address the issues and engage them in treatment. And so it's with respect to the topic that we put out there in the trauma-informed perspective, I think that can exist in terms of both parents. We saw evidence of the clinical screeners commenting on mothers' both protective capacity but also choices in terms of relationships and ability to engage productively in relationships currently and in terms of their history of partners. And then also the need to encourage the caseworker to work with both parents, even if they're not in the same residence, as they're both a part of the case, and the interaction between the two of them is a part of the reason that it comes in. So I think, in treatment and even sometimes in child welfare work, we tend to take an individualistic perspective, and we really need to make that shift to engaging in the family dynamic and the family perspective and understand the implications for practice that has.
Another question we've received is a little long, but I'll bear with me. From the perspective of parents who were traumatized as children, it might seem that there is little demarcation between child, adolescent, and adult traumas. One traumatic experience often leads to the next. At some point, society determines that these parents should be responsible for behaviors that are often responses to traumas and their treatment. What are your thoughts about the child welfare system's responsibility for the treatment of traumatized parents, especially for those parents who were in protective custody as children themselves?
I'll start out and invite Jill and Robert to augment. I think the first point I would make is that in terms of the recommendations that come out of these assessments, the quality of these assessments and the value in terms of informing services and treatment really came through in the specificity of those recommendations. So where the child welfare caseworker and the clinician could not only make a recommendation for a particular treatment or individual therapy, a particular program, but they could detail what it was that treatment or service was meant to address based on what they saw in the assessment. So where they recognized a significant history that this parent had of experiences in childhood, adolescence, accomplishing those developmental tasks and being improving functioning in adulthood, where they recognized that kind of pattern, could they speak to those very concretely in the recommendations? Could they say this individual needs or would benefit from individual therapy to address this issue? I think that speaks to the compliance issue that Jill raised and how the assessments can inform that service provision, and it also matters for the engagement of those parents. So, as I pointed out, many of these parents informed the child welfare caseworker and the clinician in the assessment that they were not necessarily interested in participating in services. So, we have to have effective services, but we have to get them to the door as well. We have to engage them and have them be willing to participate in those services. And so, understanding again how the history, that developmental progression of what they have experienced, and particularly past treatment experiences. If they've had negative treatment experiences, you can sort of understand why they may be resistant to engage in services at this time. So that all needs to come together in terms of the child welfare practice and the way in which the worker is trying to move that parent to a space where they're more willing to participate in a formal service recommendation.
Ada, just a couple of comments about that. You said in your beginning comments that you reiterated that in the United States we have a very high threshold for removal because we're loath to separate children from their parents. And I think all of us would agree that that is an American experience that we all appreciate and we respect. But when we make those choices to separate children from families, then the standards for us, meaning the child welfare system, are very, very high. And what I mean by that is we shouldn't be having conversations about what we do to children when we traumatize them in the child welfare system. But we do have those conversations because sometimes that's exactly what our system does. So when we allow children to have multiple placements in foster care, we are probably, in many cases, traumatizing and re-traumatizing children over and over again. When we place children in poor quality foster homes, we are traumatizing them again. When we allow children to be abused in foster or kinship homes, we are traumatizing them again. And when we make the wrong decision so that children then re-enter care, we are re-traumatizing them again. And I say we, because although other agents and other actors may be actually being abusive or being maltreating children, we are the agents and we are the actors that make those choices. We are the agents and we are the actors that allow poor quality foster care to exist in the United States. So I'd rather be in a place 10 or 15 years from now where the question that was asked can't be asked. Whether we're not, where we're in a place where we're not saying, gee, is it our responsibility to take care of the kids who are now adults who we traumatized when they were in our protective system? The point is we create our protective system because we know they're being traumatized at home. And so therefore, we should only be involved in their lives if we can give them an exceedingly high sense of security that we will not re-traumatize them again by our actions.
I probably a lot of follow-up on that. I think that I agree, Ada, with the assessments that Jill and Cheryl have outlined, and certainly the child welfare system can be responsible for creating another level of abusive parents, but also not dealing with the family can create even worse scenarios. And often I look at what's happening here in Chicago in terms of the violence, and I wonder whether or not when we made the decision in the mid-'90s, the late '90s, the early 2000s, not to intrude into the lives of families, whether or not that is now the result of some of the violence that we see in the city, where we don't deal with the parents' absence, or we don't deal with the parents' drug abuse or mental health issues, might lead to children who are kind of left out there to fend for themselves and not have an appreciation of family. But that's another question. But one of the cautionaries I try to give about looking at parents, whether they're teen parents or whether they're adult parents, history of abuse is what I see with some of my clients who are teen parents is more of a quickness to study them and consider them not necessarily good parents and remove their children from them. And so that's something that we often fight against, where a young lady or a young man, some of the things that they might do or compliance that they might not, the lack of compliance that they might have with their own service plans as children might be used as a cudgel in their cases as parents. Now, that's not to say that dealing with those issues of their own previous abuse is not often the key to and can be a tool, if you can resolve it, to making them better parents. That's not to say that, but it's to say that sometimes they're under the shroud of you're in the system and you're probably going to perpetrate the same kind of abuse or neglect that was perpetrated against you. And so we have to be careful, and I think cautionary as a system, on how we look at those issues.
Any questions here in the room?
And I do want to add something. I see Gene has his hand up, and I think that though that the IA was a tool to deal with. We had a lot of fights with DCFS in the late '90s about multiple moves, multiple placements, and I think the integrated assessment was. As a result of a lawsuit, one of the tools that DCFS tried to use in order to identify issues, both for the parents, which is important, but for the children, to try to lessen the numbers, the moves, so you can pick the right foster home for these children.
We'll take a question here.
Hi, Gene Griffin from Northwestern University Medical School. Dr. Smithcall, in your study you said about a third of the families were reunited, but about half the parents didn't want to participate in services. So to Dr. Barrick's point, would you be able in your study to look at which services parents were more willing to participate in, and if so, which of those were more or less effective?
We do not have that data organized in the, so this study drew primarily on records and information that exist in the child welfare system. In that sense, it's good in terms of informing what has been done and documented. But that kind of systematic tracking of services that were offered, refused, participated in, completed, does not exist. I think that speaks to one of Jill's points about needing better data to inform prognosis. We need to really understand. So we have now these sort of snapshots of the first 45 days in these full assessments, and we have an outcome 30 months down the road, and we're missing the information in between to really understand what did we do or not do that facilitated that outcome.
We have another question from a listener, and it's about how do you determine and assess parental capacity to learn or integrate new parenting practices, or how to benefit from the array of services that may be provided for children or themselves when the children are in out-of-home care. So the whole concept of parental capacity seems to be a very important aspect. And how do the professionals, because I personally will put together both the social work practitioner as well as the legal representative, how do they assess it and then determine what's best for the family and for the child?
Okay. Well, I often leave the assessment up to, the clinicians, really, to make that sort of an assessment early on in the case. But again, as a practitioner, that's not necessarily anything that I stick with. I think it's an entree to what's happening with the family. So if there's an assessment that's done and there are identified issues, hopefully they will be offering the services that are calculated to resolve those things. But really, I look at the proof is in the pudding. So I look at both how, not just compliance, but effective compliance, and also of the parent, and also, the goals. And the truth is, even though we're in this legal system, it often is helpful if you get to know the parent yourself as the lawyer that represents the child. So often we'll ask to be able to speak to a parent, to see what's going on with them. And certainly we look at it through the children's eyes and in terms of how they view their parent and maybe resolving those issues.
Can I just also respond? I guess I'm puzzled by the word capacity, because capacity sort of speaks to a future orientation, and I don't know that we're very good at assessing the future. We sort of are pretty modest about assessing what's in front of us, and we're really good at seeing what happened in the past. So parental capacity has to do with what might happen. Now, I feel like I'm a pretty competent parent right now, but my 14-year-old is about to become a full-blown teenager. I don't know if I have the capacity to parent her well, because that's about the future and about a new developmental stage and new things that I'm going to have to figure out how to do when the time comes. So I guess I'm uncomfortable with the language, and I guess part of the reason I'm uncomfortable with the language is that also I'm not entirely sure it's fair. I really want our system to be about fairness because it's a legal system based upon the fact that the government has separated children from their parents, which is one of the most fundamental activities a government can be involved in, one of the most fundamentally intrusive activities a government can be involved in. So it has to be a fair system. So I think we should be assessing whether or not parents currently are able to parent their children appropriately and adequately, not whether they might have the capacity in the future to do that well. So our assessments should be based upon recognition of their parents' behavioral abilities in the moment to parent their children adequately today, maybe tomorrow, but certainly not a couple of years from now. So I'd rather our child welfare system were designed around objective measures that many people could agree that they saw parents who were behaving appropriately and adequately towards their children, rather than our supposition about what they might be able to do. Because my assessment of what someone might be able to do might be different than Robert's and might be different than Cheryl's, and that's not a system based upon fairness.
If I could just add to that, I think, good quality assessments draw on a multitude of information sources. So it's not only the interactions with the individual, it's the perspectives from multiple individuals in the family, it's the observation of the interaction between the parent and the child, it's the indicators of attachment. I know in previous conversations, Robert and I were talking about how they may tend to that as they watch the case progress and see how that attachment is holding. In addition to the sort of critical question that Jill put out there about what we mean by that, I also think we need to turn that question on the system. So what is it that we have done or not done to support that assessment and that change process? Because where we are determining that a parent has not achieved that change or does not have that capacity, we should also be taking a critical look at, what level of engagement there has been between the worker and the parent in terms of the availability of the services. Have we structured the system in a way that has maximized the ability of this parent to achieve success as we've tried to ask them to make these changes?
Well, as a segue and a follow-up to that, I want to raise two issues. One, APSA and the timeline that workers are constrained by, and how a parent may feel that you say you have support for me, but I know concurrent planning is looming there. And I think it also is a good segue to Cheryl's first question, which is, how do we think about reasonable efforts and reasonable timelines for reunification anyway?
I'm not starting first again.
Well, I'm going to actually ask Jill to speak to some of this because I think she's much more well-versed in the policy aspects of ASFA. But, I raised the question because I think, the idea that 18 months is a time frame that's reasonable for the entire population doesn't fit with the more nuanced understanding that we're developing of the families involved with the system. The better our assessment capabilities are in terms of the child welfare system, the more variability we understand among these families. And there will be some for which this 18-month timeline is quite reasonable, and there will be others where there are some concerns. And it doesn't mean that you automatically from the beginning say you can't do it, as Jill pointed out,
but we should be very cognizant from the beginning of the challenges and the level of effort. So maybe an 18-month time frame would be reasonable for all families if you allowed for a differential level of effort across all of those. I mean, could you get families that have significant problems to that point in 18 months if you had 24/7 service or, complete wraparound? I don't know. We don't have those kind of service capabilities or the research to demonstrate that. But I think it's a reasonable question about where the change should occur. Should it occur in terms of the amount of time that we give to parents or the level of effort on the system and the supports that the systems put in place for that change to occur?
So my only comments about this are that you're right, Cheryl. The policy is a big blunt instrument, and it does say 18 months is our reunification timeline for everybody. And then various states have implemented more age-sensitive reunification timelines, so that if there are very young children involved, for example, there might be much shorter timelines because of the interests of the children prevailing in that particular instance. And then there are states that have developed sort of circumstance-sensitive reunification timelines. So, for example, you have California and now Washington State looking to have different reunification timelines that are longer for parents who might be incarcerated. So I think that right now policymakers are trying to balance this parental rights versus children's needs and what's the amount of time based upon their own best guess of what they think the right thing might be to do. And that we could probably do better. I think that to the extent that we can develop a research infrastructure where we really understand whether reunification services in general make a difference and which reunification services make a difference, or whether there are some sort of intrapersonal psychological differences that are characterological, whether parents have just different sort of characterological traits that make them more likely to want to reunify versus not reunify. We really don't know very much about whether the reunification process is an individualized intra-psychological experience or it's an externally motivated and externally driven process by our service system from the outside. So until we have a better sense of what drives reunification, why do parents reunify, and once we know whether or not our service technology is actually a driver, how long the average reunification process takes, I wouldn't mess around with policy for a while. It'd be great to figure out, on average, X, Y, and Z reunification services seem to make a difference for the majority of families. And when it makes a difference, it seems to take between X and Y number of months. Then we could develop policy based upon that, knowing what our averages were, rather than right now, sort of a best guess and a political compromise between many different groups negotiating for prominence for their group of interest within the child welfare system.
I don't know, and as I mentioned earlier, that if you're truly looking at individuals as that you can set a certain policy that has to be applied across the board in every case. We certainly, and certainly our advocacy is based on, what's happening with the child and the family at the time. So there can be these lofty goals, and I think for the benefit of most folks, because, quite frankly, in the early 90s in Cook County, we had, children that were in just for years and years, probably beyond what they needed to be in. And until there were certain timelines that were slapped down, then the courts and the various systems started to shorten those timelines. But the one thing that I absolutely hate as a lawyer is when I have a judge that's saying, this case has been open for 6 months or 2 years, and I'm not, this child is languishing in the system, no matter where if they're placed with the most loving grandmother in America, and the parent hasn't gotten their acts together. Sometimes, okay, maybe it's going to take that much longer. So I think really what the important thing is, and again, luxury of being a practitioner is, I don't want to be held to somebody else's standard that is developed by, and this is no pejorative here, by academics and clinicians. So,
spoken like a lawyer. Any questions here? Because we're getting lots on the from our listening audience, but I want to make sure there's an opportunity.
Hi, Kate Buchanan with the Child Care Association. You'd spoken a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences of parents, and one of them being not being protected as a child themselves. And could you talk about how you see that affecting their ability to protect their children, and how one learns those skills if those were not modeled for them? And also how, once you know that about a parent's childhood experience, how does that impact placement decisions and how you work with a foster parent, if it's a grandparent, et cetera, in terms of building those protective factors in the foster home?
I'll start by reiterating one of the points that I made earlier, which is I just want to be careful to say that this study does not support any sort of conclusion that those kind of experiences in childhood are automatically predictive of a lack of capacity or functioning, as a parent. What was clear to us in reviewing the narratives and the reports of these parents is that they not only described the particular experience that they had. Examples are, children who described witnessing a family member get shot, children who witnessed domestic violence within the home, children who were abused themselves, recall parents being intoxicated and passing out. Not only did they describe those kind of experiences, but in their own voluntary narrative with the clinician, they talked about the way in which they felt that there was another adult there who was not intervening. That became a significant part of their experience of the event, was that they in retrospect, were reflecting on the fact that they knew there was another adult there who was not protecting. So, what does that mean in terms of the current space they're in and the modeling in the intervention? I think part of it is that in practice, you need to understand the way in which they have interpreted those past experiences. And you have to engage in that, or have the clinician provider engage in that. There is some criticism out there of the ACEs studies and the retrospective recall of some of these events. And I think my response to that is that whether it's the objective truth or not, the fact that they are relaying this in their account of their experience has meaning, and it has meaning for your engagement and intervention with them. And so that's what we need to focus on in terms of understanding the potential of our interventions. And I use that word intervention broadly because I mean not only the formal sort of mental health service treatment providers, but also the engagement that the caseworker is doing with the parent. And we need to look for those opportunities for modeling. I think, to my first point that it's not predictive, the reason it's not predictive is that we know there are some parents who had these kinds of experiences and do not end up involved in the child welfare system and become functioning parents and adults. The reason for that is also just as important to study. There were protective factors there. There were resiliency in the individual, or a network of support, or an intervention of some sort that contributed to that individual becoming a healthy, functioning adult. So we need to keep our eye on both of these things, and to the extent that we can understand also that population that had experiences but regained their sort of health and functioning, we want to, take those preventive steps to provide that for those families as well, and for the next generation of children who may have some of those experiences.
Robert?
Oh, well, in a real practical sense, to know that a parent experienced, abusive or neglectful trauma as a youth, for me, it says that, because our first choice is to go to family for placement. And if we know that the parent had that kind of a background, then we're generally not looking to place a child with that parent's parent then, or that relative that exhibited that sort of abuse or neglect on them themselves. So and it's borne true. I mean, in cases recently, we've had cases where a mother began saying, "Don't place my child with my mother because she was abusive to me," and then they couldn't find another family placement, so she said, "Okay, place with my mom," and then that grandmother meted out the same sort of abuse, actually worse, because I think the child ended up dead. If I'm not, I mean, that's anecdotal, of course, yeah. but it's important in terms of placement. It's important in terms of the family dynamics and family counseling as well, because sometimes children don't understand that their grandparent themselves was, caused this sort of thing to their parent, and that's why they're not placed there. So it comes into play when you're talking about family counseling as well.
Let's get on this side. Yes, please.
Marcia Nathan, Casa, DuPage County. There's been a lot of discussion today about the dependence on the integrated assessment, and I was wondering, because Dr. Smithkop in particular, you stated that we depend on good quality assessments. Do we ever revisit these? Do we ever redo them? Like within 45 days, what are the chances that the people are totally honest? Do you find that things aren't working? Do you go back and do it? Just curious on that.
The current structure of the program is that this dual professional model, where the licensed clinician works with the child welfare caseworker, occurs in only the initial assessment, the first 45 days. That assessment does get updated throughout the life of the case. It is primarily updated by the caseworker, although they may reach out for consultation at times. I think this question is surfacing within the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services about, the value of this kind of comprehensive, intensive assessment and where it's best leveraged throughout the child welfare system. So, in the original design of the program, they decided that they needed that kind of comprehensive picture as early as possible when assuming custody of the child. And now, as we develop more nuanced understanding of the families involved, and we look at sort of the value and benefit of this assessment process, I think the department is considering different models for that. I'm not sure, based on the evaluation that we've done over the last 5 years, I'm not sure I could make the case that every single family needs that intensive dual professional model throughout the life of the case. But I do think we're learning a lot about particular types of cases where that kind of perspective would be very valuable and might be repeated in the ongoing assessments as well. Robert?
I'm not sure that we see the updating, as a formal structure or even as an informal structure at all in the life of the case. I think that I certainly believe that in the initial stage of the case, there should be a nice comprehensive, sit down and let's talk about what the factors are in this particular case and how we can fix it. But I don't know if there's enough follow through beyond that, like in 6 months or after the trial has occurred. And certainly I would like to see something more like that. But it becomes an issue of money, I think. In practical terms, and right now the state and certainly the county is broke, and but I think that it's an important thing that should occur, and we should find the money, because really we know that this system and the good of it or the bad of it or the involvement of it really impacts all the other systems in terms of educational systems. Jobs. These are bigger questions. Let me be quiet now. But no, I think there should be a tool, though, as you suggest. It's that something more formal happens later on in the case.
I think to that point, I'm getting a number of questions asking about, in essence, what kinds of supports for workers do you think are there to do these positive kinds of approaches that you're addressing, not focused just on compliance, be sensitive to these various issues. But in the real world, what kinds of practical supports, tools, activities? I know, Jill, you said we don't know very much about successful services, but for the practitioners, what right now can they do to make a difference later today or tomorrow as they are trying to address their cases and be advocates for their families?
Just a couple of thoughts. I think that there's two levels to that. There is both the line worker, the caseworker, and the supervisor. So the supervisors and managers can work to create environments that are supportive and less chaotic and more organized and supportive, emotionally supportive for staff. And I think the work of Charles Glisson really suggests that organizations that are well organized and supportive and psychologically supportive to line staff are going to get better services for families. And so that would be the first thing to think about, is just what is the organizational context in which caseworkers work. The second is about caseworkers, and I think that caseworkers could be thinking about this notion of sequencing services. Think about whether or not you're going to impose, say, 8 different services on a family immediately, all at once, or whether there are ways to sequence those over time. Think about co-location of services whenever possible, so that these families who, if they do have to do 8 different services in a week, aren't having to get on a bus and go 2 hours from service to service in order to meet the demands of their case plan. Think about coordinating services more between being sort of a broker of services. So among different service providers, do some coordination of services. And then finally, work with their agency to really be reflective about whether or not the multiple service demands that we're placing on families are really needed and are really appropriate, and have important conversations as a community about the nature and the frequency of services that are required, that are mandated on families.
I have to say that, we talked about this earlier, Jill and I and the rest of the folks. And I don't see so many cases here in Cook County where there are 8 different services a parent has to do within a week. There might be 8 issues that they should think about and do, but not specific services. It's not like, 8 different counseling sessions or drug sessions. But one of the things that here practically for Cook County is, I think, it really varies, unfortunately, agency by agency. Here, it's probably 80% of the cases are managed by private agencies and 20% by DCFS, the state agency, which is generally the umbrella. And you can see the accessibility varies among agencies. Agencies with more money are able to offer more things, services, or whatever supports for the families as well as for the caseworkers. And agencies with less money, it's extremely different. And so I think that there needs to be something undertaken in a practical sense, that the things that might be available for DCFS or might be available for One Hope United or for a smaller agency should mirror each other. And I think that would be helpful to the caseworkers as well as to the families.
I have to say, in the evaluation that we've done of the integrated assessment program, one of the things that has fascinated me over the last couple of years is this dual professional model. And it doesn't mean that this particular model has to be replicated, but I really think there's value in understanding what happens in this model in terms of the practice space. We ask a lot of child welfare caseworkers. Mm-hmm. They are out there in the field putting themselves in this space with families, using their skills to
engage the family in what can be a very chaotic, unstable environment. It's often crisis-oriented at the time that they're going in. And the work that they're doing is relationship-based. It's very, very difficult. So, having this model where the worker is opening up their practice space to allow a clinician, somebody else who is independently supervised and independently employed in this role to come in and work with them, is asking more of them. And that is difficult as well. But it's so valuable. And we have heard from some of the workers how their perspective on practice has changed a little bit, and some of the challenges of doing that. In one of the earlier reports of the model, the workers would, in the interviews, tell us about, yes, that's all nice that we can understand all of what's going on for that family, but if I don't have those services, I can't go into court and bring that in because I'm going to be held accountable for that. So we have to create that practice space for the reflective practice that Jill talks about, support it with supervision, allow for those independent perspectives, but also build the infrastructure of the system to support that kind of practice as well. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that this particular model needs to be replicated everywhere, but I think there's a lot of value in understanding what elements of this model make a difference in terms of the practice that the frontline workers are doing and that the supervisors can support.
I think we're on the right side. Matt? Yeah.
Hi, Becky Shadeen from Northwestern University. This is a question for Dr. Smithgall. In looking at parents with childhood trauma, I guess this is a two-part question. The ACE score 4 or more for moms compared to dads was about twice as high for mothers, and I wondered if that has to do with the likelihood for self-reporting from males versus females. And then the second question kind of related to that is whether you observed any sort of difference in prognosis or outcomes compared to mothers versus fathers versus single-parent households.
So to the first one, I think based on the interviews that we did with clinical screeners and caseworkers, I do think that there were indications that they felt that sometimes the fathers struggled more in terms of responding to some of the questions. For example, in one of the interviews, a clinical screener said, when I asked these questions about trauma and their history, they just kind of looked at me. I don't think they had ever been asked that before. So there was a sense that it might be a little bit different experience for fathers. But I think, the other thing that really needs to be kept in mind, and that I didn't necessarily sort of highlight in the methodological details, these data are from assessments where parents did participate. So what we're capturing is the percent of fathers who agreed to participate in an assessment who had those ACEs of 4 or more. There's another set of fathers who perhaps refused to participate, couldn't be located, were no longer involved with the family. And so we have to keep in mind who's not on our radar for looking at these data as well. Now remind me of your second question about prognosis.
Just whether you saw any differences between bio moms versus bio dads versus like single parent households.
Yeah. We did a paper looking only at father engagement and father involvement, and it was a combination of looking at these early assessments but then also talking to workers about sort of the ongoing practice of the cases. And what did come out of there is an indication that that engagement with fathers may fall off after that initial assessment. So we don't necessarily have a lot of data on the differential prognosis, but we do have some reason to be concerned about the ongoing engagement of fathers to address the issues that come up and that are important to address even if they are not the custodial parent that might be the focus of the reunification. The single parent issue is something that we are taking a look at now, and interestingly, there seems to be some regional variability in that. So, single parent households do seem to be at greater risk for
poor reunification outcomes. But the regional variability makes us sort of question what is underneath that, what is underlying that. It's a little bit too early for us to answer the question, but it's definitely something to keep looking at.
Can I ask a question? What about those single parents where both parents, though, were involved? So like a single mom, but the father doesn't live with the family, but he's involved with the kids.
We saw some wonderful cases when we looked at the assessments for father engagement and the role of the fathers. We saw some wonderful cases where the father was not custodial, was not in the household, but because the father was engaged in the process of the assessment and the process of what was going on with the case, they made some decisions that were important to the child outcomes. They made decisions like there was a father who moved out of his mother's house so that his mother could care for the child. The child could be in a kinship setting. There was a father who supported the mother through child care assistance or paying for certain services for the child, providing transportation for the child. So, really understanding the value of father's contributions, even if they're in non-custodial situations, is an important part of that assessment and ongoing service process.
Question.
Are you sure?
Paul Anderson. I'm an historian of child welfare.
Oh, wow.
I'd like to ask Cheryl in particular and the panel in general about the relationship of non-mandated services to mandated services for the families you've been discussing. Apparently, you've got one generation with mandated followed by another with mandated. Were there any ancillary services that come into play or should come into play? Something like visiting nurses, for example.
Meaning, so out of the assessment, were there recommendations for some of those services, or did we see participation in those services?
Have they been involved?
Again, to Jean's question earlier, I don't think we have sufficient information at a systematic way about the service provision and engagement of those services. The one thing that came to mind as I was listening to your question is that in these comprehensive assessments, and we saw this particularly in terms of the assessments of fathers, there was because they were thorough and really looking at all aspects of the parent's functioning, they would acknowledge some housing needs, the importance of employment and the potential for employment services. But in the written service plans, there would be an emphasis on sort of the formal services that you might traditionally expect the child welfare system to provide: individual therapy, substance abuse treatment, domestic violence treatment, things like that. And then there would be language that said, and the father should also secure stable housing, and the father should also secure stable employment. But it was not necessarily embraced in the same way as a responsibility for the child welfare system to make that connection or that service. I'm not sure if that answers your question entirely.
Well, if by mandated you mean, in terms of a court system, that it's ordered by the court either as an order of protection or they look at the service plan and say these are the things you should comply with before you get visits or before you get return home. Anecdotally, I can look at the cases that we see in the abuse and neglect courts, and in the cases, because we also represent children in some custody and divorce cases, the parents are definitely more apt to participate in services that are either mandated by the court or suggested by the caseworkers than they do in the divorce courts. We don't see the same kind of real deep involvement in either. I mean, you'll see the same issues. You'll see substance abuse. You'll see allegations of sexual abuse, but you don't see parents as engaged unless somebody's told them they have to do it. We have a case now that we're looking at appealing out of the divorce court where the father was convicted of criminal sexual abuse of a neighbor, babysitter for one of the children. And because the criminal court did not mandate counseling, didn't say you should complete counseling as part of your parole, he never engaged. And it wasn't until the divorce court raised an issue about whether or not he had resolved that issue as to whether or not he can have even visits with his child, that there's some discussion or tacit involvement in treatment. And so I think that the court can act as a huge cudgel in terms of saying you have to do this and parents' compliance with it. That makes sense.
I think it's important to note that the population of parents that we kind of provided information about, at least in highlighting this study, are not necessarily representative of all the parents that are served in the child welfare system. And, from other work that we're doing, we do see that a number of families who are a part of an indicated investigation do not ever get opened for service. Their cases do not get opened for services at all in the child welfare system. And sometimes the indicating reason that the investigator lists in the record is that they had a community-based service referral, or that the parent was willing to participate in services. So there's likely a population of parents who do engage with those services, maybe even seek them out themselves once involved with the child welfare system in the investigative process. But where we've talked about this set of families this morning, they are more perhaps isolated, longer histories, and more resistant to participation in those services.
So, Robert, I'm going to give you the last question, and you only have about a minute and a half, but I think it's an important tying the bow.
I'm afraid.
Don't be scared. So, we've talked about what the workers need to do, how we all need to think about it a little differently. What needs to be done, and how do we approach and educate the judges who make the final decisions on what is going to happen to children? And you can address it recognizing there's two sets of professionals.
Yeah.
There's both what the social worker brings forth, caseworker, and then there's also what the advocate for the child or mom brings forth to both the judge and the prosecutor.
What comes out of all of this to me is how individual cases are. And I think that sometimes judges want things, I'm getting in trouble, tied up in nice little boxes and
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically speaking, thank you, Ada.
That's our cover.
Like things, not all judges, I should say, like things tightened up in a nice little ball. So that they can fit the cookie cutter thing, so they can do the, kinds of services, or they can look at something, and say, well, this person did this, and so I should be comfortable in sending the children home. I think they have to be open and step back a little bit and understand, from whence parents come, from whence the families come, and really kind of individualize the cases. Don't just look at what the timelines are in the statute. Don't just look at what the check mark is on the service plan, but really look at who the families are, and try to get more of an idea of what that means in terms of parents and their abilities to take care of their children safely.
And that only comes from the professionals who can bring it forward.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Social workers.
And lawyers. So, I would like to thank our audience, both here and those of you who are viewing, for giving your time to us today, and I hope you have enjoyed this very interesting discussion and topic. I want to thank Cheryl Smithgall and Jill Durberick and Robert Harris for presenting and engaging with all of us today. And I also want to remind everyone that this program will be posted along with every other forum that we've done on the Chapin Hall website. It usually takes a couple weeks, but please feel free to refer to others to our website and to view it for all of the other programs we had. So on behalf of all of us at Chapin Hall, I'd like to thank everyone very much and to wish you a wonderful day.